On the 14th of August 1356, the inhabitants of Poitiers watched as English archers formed battle lines on a hill near the vineyards. No one then understood that this battle would be but one of hundreds in a conflict that would stretch for more than a century and change the fate of two kingdoms. But to understand how this bloodshed came about, one must go back several decades, when the seeds of enmity were just sprouting in the royal chambers of Paris and London. At the beginning of the 14th century, relations between England and France resembled smoldering embers under ashes. English kings owned vast territories on the continent, a legacy of Henry II's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine back in the 10th century. Gascony, part of Aquitaine, remained under the English crown, but formally these lands were considered a fief of the French king. The English monarch swore a vassal oath to the French king, which humiliated the pride of the island kingdom. Each time an English king knelt before the French throne, it served as a reminder of the precariousness of his position on the continent. French kings from the Capetian dynasty had for centuries strengthened central power, gradually subjugating unruly feudal lords. Philip IV the Fair, who ruled until 1314, created a powerful bureaucratic apparatus and expanded the royal domain. His sons, Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV, successively occupied the throne, but all died without leaving male heirs. When Charles IV passed away in 1328, the direct male line of the Capetians was broken. The question arose, who would inherit the French crown? There were two claimants, Philip of Valois, nephew of Philip the Fair through his father's line, and the English king Edward III, grandson of the same Philip the Fair through his mother's line. French jurists quickly found a solution, relying on an ancient Frankish law, the Salic law, according to which women could not transmit rights to the throne. Edward, whose mother Isabella was Philip the Fair's daughter, was thus excluded from the succession. The crown passed to Philip of Valois, who was crowned as Philip VI. Edward III remained silent then. He was young, had only recently ascended the English throne, and needed recognition from France for his possessions in Gascony. For several years, a fragile peace was maintained between the kingdoms. Edward even traveled to Amiens and paid homage to Philip for his French holdings. But the humiliation gnawed at the English monarch's soul, especially as French officials constantly interfered in the administration of Gascony, provoking conflicts with local seigneurs. Philip VI sought to subjugate the unruly province, while Edward saw this as an attempt to strip him of his last continental possessions. Tension grew with each passing year. The spark that ignited the flame of war was Flanders, the wealthiest region, where the finest European cloths were produced. Flemish cities like Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres depended on English wool, supplied to their weaving workshops. The Count of Flanders was a vassal of the French king, but the urban patricians gravitated towards England, seeing it as a source of prosperity. When Philip VI tried to strengthen his control over Flanders, the citizens rebelled. In 1337, Jacob van Artevelde, a wealthy cloth merchant from Ghent, led an uprising against the Count and called upon Edward III for help. The English king saw an opportunity. Flanders could become a staging ground for war with France, and recognition of his rights to the French throne, a legitimate pretext for invasion. In 1339, Edward officially declared himself King of France, incorporating the French lilies into his coat of arms alongside the English leopards. This declaration sounded like a challenge to the entire French kingdom. Philip VI responded by confiscating Gascony. War became inevitable. The first military actions unfolded in the north. Edward crossed into Flanders with a small army and began negotiations with local cities, promising trade privileges in exchange for military support. Simultaneously, he sought allies among German princes, distributing gold right and left. The Holy Roman Emperor, Louis IV of Bavaria, appointed Edward his vicar in the Low Countries for a generous fee, which lent an appearance of legitimacy to English actions. But all these diplomatic maneuvers required vast sums of money, and the English treasury began to empty. In the summer of 1340, the English army invaded Cambrésis, a northern French province. Soldiers burned villages, drove off livestock, and ravaged fields, a tactic that would become common throughout the war. The French called this chevauchée, a destructive raid aimed at undermining the enemy's economy and forcing them to accept battle on unfavorable terms. Philip VI assembled a large army and marched to meet the English, but a general engagement did not materialize. Both armies stood facing each other for several days near the village of Bouvines, but neither dared to attack. In the end, the English retreated, and Philip returned to Paris. This first campaign highlighted the weaknesses of both sides. The English army was small and depended on unreliable allies, who quickly lost enthusiasm when money ran out. The French army, composed of knightly cavalry and urban militias, was unwieldy and poorly commanded. Philip VI preferred a defensive tactic, hoping to wear down the enemy with a protracted war. But the very next year, events would take an unexpected turn when the war spread to the sea. On the 24th of June, 1341, the first major naval battle of the war unfolded in the strait off the Flemish port of Sluys. The French fleet, numbering around 200 ships, lay at anchor, preparing for an invasion of England. The ships were chained together, forming a floating fortress. Thousands of soldiers were on their decks: Genoese crossbowmen, French knights, Lombard mercenaries. The commanding admirals, Hugues Quiret and Nicolas Béhuchet, were confident of victory. The English fleet approached at dawn. Edward III personally commanded a squadron of 190 ships, tightly packed with archers. The king understood that the outcome of the battle would decide the fate of the entire campaign. Defeat at sea would mean the end of his ambitions in France. English ships lined up and began to close in. When the distance shortened to an arrow's flight, the archers began their volley. Thousands of arrows rained down on the French decks, turning them into a bloody mess. The French tried to retaliate with crossbow fire, but the rate of fire of English longbows was incomparably higher. A crossbowman fired once, while an archer unleashed 6 or 7 arrows. The Genoese fell by the hundreds, unable to reload their weapons. French knights, encased in armor, were helpless under the hail of arrows. When the English ships closed in, boarding commenced. English soldiers leaped onto the chained French vessels, hacking at everyone they encountered. By evening, the battle concluded with the complete rout of the French fleet. The slaughter was horrific. The French lost almost all their ships and over 16,000 men killed. Both admirals perished. Quiret fell in battle, while Béhuchet was captured and executed. The waters of the strait turned red with blood. Corpses floated among the wreckage of ships. Contemporaries wrote that if fish could speak, they would tell of that battle in all languages, for they had gorged themselves on dead Frenchmen, Englishmen, and Flemings. Edward III won a brilliant victory, securing English dominance at sea for many years, but the war on land stalled. Edward's allies became disillusioned with his ability to pay the promised subsidies. German princes one by one abandoned the alliance. Flemish cities began to grumble, demanding concrete results. The English treasury was empty. The king owed enormous sums to Italian bankers, and major banking houses like Bardi and Peruzzi were on the verge of collapse due to unreturned loans. Edward understood that a decisive victory was needed, otherwise the entire undertaking would fail. In 1345, military actions resumed with new vigor. Edward landed in Normandy with an army of about 10,000 men, 4,000 archers, 2,500 heavily armed cavalry, and 3,500 infantry. The English moved deep into French territory, burning everything in their path. Towns and villages were reduced to ashes. Soldiers plundered churches, raped women, and killed anyone who resisted. Columns of smoke rose over Normandy, visible for dozens of miles. Edward deliberately provoked Philip VI, hoping to draw him into battle. The French king assembled a huge army, estimated at 25,000 to 40,000 men, and moved to intercept the English. Edward continued to retreat north towards Flanders, where reinforcements awaited him. The French pursued him, burning bridges over rivers and trying to cut off his escape routes. Several times the English found themselves in critical situations, but each time they found a way to cross the water barriers. In August, the English army forded the Somme at Blanquetac, where the water was chest-deep for the soldiers. The French rearguard tried to prevent the crossing, but English archers cleared the opposite bank. Having crossed, Edward realized that further retreat was impossible. His army was exhausted by the long march. The horses were spent, food supplies were running out. Battle had to be joined. The king chose a position near the village of Crécy, where gentle hills gave an advantage to the defenders. On the 26th of August, 1346, the English took up a defensive position on a hillside. Edward divided his army into 3 divisions. The right flank was commanded by the 16-year-old Prince of Wales, nicknamed the Black Prince for the color of his armor. The left flank was led by the Earl of Northampton. The king himself took a position in reserve, from where he could survey the entire battlefield. Archers lined up in wedges on the flanks, dismounted knights and infantry in the center. Before the English positions, wolf pits were dug, camouflaged with grass, to break horses' legs. The French army approached in the afternoon. Philip wanted to postpone the battle until the next morning, allowing his soldiers to rest after the march. But the knights demanded an immediate attack. They saw before them a small English force and yearned for a glorious victory. French commanders could not restrain the impetuosity of the nobility, and the order to advance was given. First moved the Genoese crossbowmen, about 6,000 mercenaries in light armor, with heavy crossbows on their shoulders. The Genoese began their uphill climb in a drizzling rain. Their bowstrings became wet and slack. Their shots became inaccurate. The English archers kept their bowstrings dry by hiding them under their clothes. When the Genoese approached within shooting range, the English archers drew their bows. 10,000 arrows soared into the air and fell upon the Genoese. Crossbowmen fell by the hundreds, unable to fire a single shot. The wounded tumbled down the slope, hindering those behind them. The Genoese formation broke and began to retreat. French knights, standing behind the Genoese, perceived their retreat as cowardice, not understanding that the mercenaries were retreating under murderous fire. The knights accused the Genoese of treason. Philip VI reportedly cried, "Kill these scoundrels. They are only getting in our way." French cavalry charged into the retreating crossbowmen, trampling them with their horses. Confusion ensued. Their own men fought their own men, while English archers continued their volley, not distinguishing between friend and foe. Through the chaos, the first wave of French knights broke through to the English positions. Armored cavalry on heavy horses charged uphill, hoping to overturn the English line, but arrows rained down on them, targeting the unprotected faces of the horses, the joints of the armor, and the narrow slits of the visors. Horses reared, threw their riders, fell, breaking their legs in hidden pits. Knights who fell from their horses could not get up in their heavy armor and became easy prey for English infantry. The few cavalrymen who reached the English positions became entangled in hand-to-hand combat with dismounted English knights. The English aristocracy fought on foot alongside common soldiers, forming a dense line. The French attacked wave after wave. According to various sources, they conducted 15 to 17 attacks over several hours. Each time the result was the same. The English met the attackers with a hail of arrows, and those who broke through died in close combat or rolled back down the slope. By evening, the field before the English positions had become a graveyard. Piles of human and horse corpses lay heaped upon each other. The wounded groaned beneath dead bodies, suffocating in the crush. The French command lost control of the army. Each detachment of knights attacked independently, striving for personal glory, without coordinating actions with their neighbors. Philip VI tried to stop the senseless slaughter, but he was not listened to. When darkness fell, the king, wounded by an arrow in the face, left the battlefield. The next morning, the English surveyed the battlefield, finishing off wounded Frenchmen and counting their losses. Among the dead were the blind King John of Bohemia, who fought on the side of France despite his blindness. He was led into battle by 2 knights, who tied his horse's bridle to their own. The Duke of Lorraine, the Counts of Flanders, Blois, Auxerre, and many other noble seigneurs perished. Around 4,000 common knights and warriors fell. English losses amounted to several hundred men, mostly infantry involved in hand-to-hand combat. The Battle of Crécy became a turning point in military affairs. It demonstrated that the era of heavy knightly cavalry's dominance was coming to an end. Simple archers, recruited from peasants and townspeople, routed the flower of French chivalry. The reasons for the French defeat were obvious: lack of discipline, disdain for infantry, inability to coordinate the actions of different branches of arms. The English army, however, showed the superiority of organization and tactics over numerical advantage and personal bravery. After Crécy, Edward III marched to Calais, a rich port city on the strait. A siege began that would last 11 months. Calais was surrounded by powerful walls and had communication with the sea, allowing the garrison to be supplied. The city's commandant, Jean de Vienne, resolutely rejected the offer of surrender. The English blockaded Calais by land and sea, built a wooden fortified camp, and prepared for a long siege. Edward brought his wife and courtiers, organizing tournaments and feasts, as if he were not at war, but on a pleasure trip. Inside Calais, hunger began. The commandant expelled useless mouths, the elderly, women, children hoping to prolong the resistance. The English did not allow the refugees through their lines, and the unfortunate people were stranded between the city walls and the siege works, dying of hunger and cold. Only at Christmas, out of mercy, did Edward allow them to be fed and released. In the spring of 1347, supplies in the city ran out, and de Vienne requested terms of surrender. Edward was furious at Calais' stubborn resistance. He had lost almost a year and enormous resources under the city. The king declared that he would massacre the entire garrison and all the city's inhabitants. Only after long negotiations and the urging of his advisors did he agree to a compromise. The lives of the townspeople would be spared if 6 of the most prominent citizens exited the city with ropes around their necks, in their shirts, and brought the keys to the city. Edward intended to execute these 6 as a warning to others. On the 3rd of August 1347, 6 volunteers, the wealthiest citizens, led by Eustache de Saint-Pierre, walked out of the city gates. Barefoot, they walked through the English camp to the royal tent, carrying the keys to Calais on their outstretched hands. Edward received them coldly, untouched by their humility, and ordered the executioner to prepare for the execution. But the pregnant Queen Philippa of Hainaut knelt before her husband, pleading for the lives of the 6. Moved by his wife's request, Edward relented and granted the prisoners their lives. The fall of Calais gave England a permanent foothold on the continent. English garrisons occupied the city. Most French inhabitants were expelled. They were replaced by English colonists. Calais would remain English for 2 centuries, becoming the main base for invasions into France. But military actions ceased for a time, not because of peace, but because of a monstrous catastrophe that swept across all of Europe. In the autumn of 1347, the first reports of a strange disease arriving from the east appeared in the southern ports of France. Genoese ships brought not only goods but also an invisible death to Marseille. The plague spread like wildfire. Those who fell ill developed a fever. Black buboes, swollen lymph nodes the size of a chicken egg, appeared on their bodies. Then began the coughing up of blood, and within a few days, the person died in terrible agony. By the spring of 1348, the epidemic had engulfed all of France. Cities were wiped out block by block. In Paris, up to 800 people died daily. Cemeteries overflowed, and the dead were piled into huge trenches outside the city walls, covered with a thin layer of earth. The clergy could not cope with the burials. Priests died as frequently as their parishioners. Many villages were completely deserted, and travelers found only corpses and wild animals there. England did not escape the plague. In the summer of 1348, the disease crossed the English Channel and struck English cities. London lost thousands of inhabitants weekly. Trade halted. Fields remained uncultivated. There was no one to plow and sow. Surviving peasants demanded higher wages, realizing they had become a valuable resource. The social structure of society was shaken. Labor became more expensive, and noble lands depreciated without anyone to cultivate them. The Black Death claimed between a third and half of Europe's population. In France, about 10 million people died. In England, about 2 million. Entire dynasties died out. Monasteries emptied. Universities closed. People saw the epidemic as God's punishment for sins. Processions of flagellants, self-flagellators, walked the roads, torturing themselves in the hope of appeasing the heavens. Jews were accused of poisoning wells and burned in entire communities, even though they died of the plague just like Christians. The war subsided for several years. There was no one to fight, and no reason to fight. Edward III and Philip VI concluded a truce, which was extended several times, but the conflict was not forgotten. In 1350, Philip VI died, and the French throne passed to his son John II, nicknamed the Good for his generosity to favorites. John was a noble knight but a weak ruler. His court was mired in intrigue. The royal treasury was empty, and the authority of the crown was waning. In England, Edward III was consolidating his power. The Black Prince, his eldest son, had developed into a brilliant military commander. The young prince yearned for glory and new victories. In 1355, the truce expired, and military actions resumed. This time, the English planned a double strike. Edward himself was to invade Normandy, while the Black Prince would conduct a raid from Aquitaine northwards. The Black Prince set out from Bordeaux in July 1356 with an army of about 6,000 men. He moved east, plundering and burning French provinces. English soldiers ravaged the rich regions of Languedoc and Berry, carrying off their spoils in wagons. The French avoided open battle, hoping to wear down the enemy with guerrilla warfare. The prince reached almost to the Loire, but learned that King John was assembling a large army to cut off the English retreat. The Black Prince turned back, aiming to return to the safety of Aquitaine. But the French caught up with him. On the 18th of September 1356, near Poitiers, the English rearguard clashed with the French vanguard. Battle was inevitable. The forces were unequal. The English numbered about 6,000 men, while the French had between 11,000 and 14,000. King John was confident of victory but made the same mistakes as his father at Crécy. The English took up a defensive position on a hill, shielded by vineyards and hedges. Archers lined up on the flanks, dismounted knights in the center. The prince ordered ditches to be dug in front of the positions and stakes to be sharpened to halt a cavalry charge. The French prepared for the offensive, and before the battle, the papal legate Cardinal Talleyrand tried to negotiate peace. The Black Prince offered to return all plunder and not wage war for 7 years in exchange for free passage. John demanded unconditional surrender and refused negotiations. On September 19 at dawn, the battle began. The French had learned from Crécy and decided to attack on foot so that archers could not shoot down the cavalry. First advanced 300 elite cavalrymen under the command of Marshals Clermont and Audrehem. They were supposed to break the English line, after which the main infantry forces would attack. The French knights galloped towards the English positions but came under murderous fire. Arrows targeted the horses, and the attack stalled before reaching its objective. Marshal Clermont died, struck by an arrow. Marshal Audrehem, seeing the futility of the attack, turned and rode away, taking the surviving cavalrymen with him. He was accused of cowardice and treason, though he was merely trying to save his men's lives. The French nobility fiercely condemned the marshal, but soon proved to have little bravery themselves. The main forces of the French army began to ascend the hill, moving in dense columns of dismounted knights. English archers continued their volley. Arrows rained down on the French. Knights, encased in heavy armor, slowly climbed the slope under the scorching sun. Many fell from exhaustion even before hand-to-hand combat began. Those who reached the English positions engaged in battle with the dismounted English knights. A desperate struggle ensued. The French pressed the enemy, but their strength waned under continuous flanking fire. The 1st French Division, commanded by the Dauphin Charles, King John's eldest son, entered the fray. The 16-year-old heir to the throne fought bravely. But his advisors, seeing that the battle was turning unfavorably, forcibly led the prince from the battlefield. Following the Dauphin, the 2nd Division of the Duke of Orleans began to retreat. 2/3 of the French army abandoned the battlefield, leaving King John and his division alone against the English. John the Good did not flinch. With his youngest son Philip, a 14-year-old boy, and his personal guard, the king continued the fight. The Black Prince, seeing the French confusion, launched a counterattack. English cavalry, previously hidden behind the hill, struck the French flank. The king's knights were surrounded. A desperate hand-to-hand struggle began. The French fought to the last. Young Philip protected his father, shouting, "Father, beware to your right. Father, beware to your left." The young prince received many wounds but survived. King John fought with a battle-axe. Around him fell his bodyguards. When it became clear that resistance was futile, several knights rushed towards the king, seeking to capture him. The capture of a king meant an enormous ransom. A fight broke out among the English themselves. Everyone wanted to claim the glory of capturing the monarch. Eventually, a French exile, Denis de Morbec, serving in the English army, persuaded John to surrender to him. The King of France became a prisoner. The Battle of Poitiers ended in a complete rout for the French. About 2,500 knights and nobles were killed. The king, his youngest son, 17 counts, 66 barons, and about 2,000 knights were taken prisoner. English losses amounted to several hundred men. The Black Prince treated the captured king with marked respect. During the feast after the battle, he personally served John, refusing to sit at the same table with him, for, as he said, he was not worthy of such an honor. The king's capture proved catastrophic for France. Power in Paris passed to the Dauphin Charles, who held the title of regent. The 19-year-old found himself in the midst of political chaos. The royal treasury was empty. The army was routed. the southern provinces ravaged by English chevauchés. The Estates General, an assembly of representatives of the estates, demanded reforms and control over the crown's expenditures. Parisians, outraged by taxes and military defeats, rebelled. Etienne Marcel, a wealthy merchant and provost of the Parisian merchants, led the Parisian uprising. Marcel demanded limitations on royal power, the execution of corrupt advisors, and administrative reform. In February 1358, a mob of Parisians led by Marcel stormed the Dauphin's palace. Before the regent's eyes, two of his marshals, Jean de Conflans and Robert de Clermont, were murdered. The Dauphin Charles was made to wear the red and blue cap of the rebels. Symbolically forced to support the revolt, the regent became a prisoner of the Parisians. Simultaneously with the urban uprising, a peasant revolt, the Jacquerie, erupted in France. Peasants in the northern provinces, driven to despair by unbearable taxes, mercenary pillaging, and seigneurial arbitrary rule, took up arms. The name Jacquerie came from the derogatory Jacques Bonhomme, Jack Simpleton, as nobles called peasants. In May 1358, peasant detachments began to burn castles, killing nobles and their families. The fury of the Jacques was terrible. They were avenging decades of humiliation. The leader of the uprising was Guillaume Caille, a peasant from the village of Mello. Caille tried to organize the peasants into a disciplined army, but most detachments acted spontaneously, driven by a thirst for revenge. Parisians, led by Marcel, initially supported the uprising, seeing the peasants as allies against the nobility. But it soon became clear that the Jacques made no distinction between good and bad lords. They killed all nobles indiscriminately, raped noble women, and burned estates. The nobility united to suppress the uprising. Charles II, the Bad, King of Navarre, a claimant to the French throne and an English ally, led a punitive expedition. On the 9th of June 1358, at Mello, the noble cavalry routed the peasant militia. Guillaume Caille was captured, tortured with red-hot iron, and beheaded. A brutal reprisal began. The nobles avenged themselves on the peasants with no less cruelty than the peasants had shown towards them. The Jacquerie was suppressed in a few weeks. With about 20,000 people killed, Etienne Marcel lost the support of the Parisians after he tried to allow Charles the Bad and English troops into the city. The townspeople realized that he was ready to surrender the capital to the enemy for his political goals. On the 31st of July 1358, a group of citizens loyal to the Dauphin killed Marcel at the city gates. The Dauphin Charles returned to Paris, re-establishing control over the capital, but France remained weakened. English garrisons controlled vast territories. King John the Good was a prisoner in England. He was kept in honorable captivity, more a guest than a captive. Negotiations for his ransom dragged on for years. Edward III demanded an enormous sum of 3 million gold écus, equivalent to France's annual income, plus the transfer of full English sovereignty over all lands formerly belonging to English kings. Normandy, Maine, Anjou, Touraine, Poitou, and an expanded Aquitaine. Such terms would have meant the dismemberment of France. The French rejected the demands. In 1359, Edward III personally led a campaign into France, intending to be crowned in Reims. This was the king's last great campaign. The English army moved from Calais through war-ravaged lands, but the French avoided battle, staying behind city walls. Edward reached the outskirts of Paris but could not take the capital. Negotiations began, and in May 1360, peace was signed at Bretigny. Under the terms of the treaty, John gained his freedom for a ransom of 3 million écus, payable in installments. England gained full sovereignty over an expanded Aquitaine, Poitou, Limousin, Calais, and other territories about a third of France. In return, Edward III renounced his claims to the French crown and the right to demand vassal homage for his continental possessions. It was a cruel but necessary peace. France was too weak to continue the war. John the Good returned to a devastated kingdom. Raising the ransom proved almost impossible. The country was exhausted by war, plague, and uprisings. French princes and noble lords were sent to England as hostages, guaranteeing payment. One of the hostages, the Duke of Anjou, the king's son, escaped from English captivity in 1363. John, bound by his knightly word, considered it his duty to return to England in place of his son. In April 1364, the King of France again departed for London. On April 8 of the same year, in London's Savoy Palace, John the Good died. The cause of death remained unclear, perhaps illness, perhaps poisoning. His body was transported to France and buried in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the necropolis of French kings. The crown passed to the Dauphin Charles, who became Charles V. The new king was the complete opposite of his father, a calculating, cautious, intelligent ruler who despised senseless knightly bravery. Charles V understood that France needed to be rebuilt from within. He reformed the tax system, established regular collection of taxes, strengthened royal finances, created a permanent army paid from the treasury instead of feudal militias, and reorganized defenses, building new fortifications and repairing old ones. Instead of pitched battles, the king focused on a protracted war, wearing down the enemy with raids and sieges, avoiding open confrontations. A key role in military policy was played by the Breton Bertrand du Guesclin, the son of a minor noble, who made a career through military talent. Du Guesclin was the complete opposite of the knightly ideal. Not tall, not handsome, crude, but a brilliant tactician and organizer. Charles V appointed him Constable of France, the kingdom's highest military commander. Du Guesclin waged a methodical war against English garrisons, besieging castles, cutting supply lines, and exhausting the enemy. In 1369, the war resumed. The formal pretext was disputes over inheritance in Aquitaine, but the true reason was Charles's desire to reclaim lost territories. Du Guesclin avoided major battles, gradually recapturing small fortresses and towns. The French employed a scorched earth tactic, destroying food supplies, driving off livestock, leaving the English with empty lands. English garrisons suffered from hunger and disease. The Black Prince, now governor, tried to halt the French advance. In 1367, he led an expedition to Castile, helping the deposed King Pedro the Cruel regain his throne. The campaign culminated in victory at Najera, where the Anglo-Gascon army defeated Franco-Castilian forces. But the campaign exhausted the prince. He contracted dysentery, which transformed the once brilliant commander into a sick, tormented man. The prince returned to Bordeaux but could no longer effectively defend Aquitaine. Du Guesclin continued to reclaim French lands. By 1374, the English had lost most of their conquests, retaining only a narrow coastal strip around Bordeaux and Bayonne, as well as Calais in the north. The Black Prince, sick and disillusioned, returned to England in 1371. He died on the 8th of June, 1376, a year before his father's death. Edward III outlived his beloved son by only a year, dying on the 21st of June, 1377, a frail old man who no longer recognized those around him. The crown of England passed to Edward's grandson, the 10-year-old Richard II, son of the Black Prince. The country was effectively ruled by the boy's uncles, primarily John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. England descended into political strife and was not active in military campaigns. In France, Charles V strengthened central authority, restored the economy, and developed arts and sciences. He was nicknamed the Wise for his successes in governing the state. On the 16th of September 1380, the king died, leaving the throne to his 12-year-old son, Charles VI. The first years of Charles VI's reign were prosperous. The kingdom was governed by a regency council, led by the king's uncles, the Dukes of Anjou, Berry, Burgundy, and Bourbon. They continued the policies of Charles the Wise, but rivalry for power and influence grew among them. When the young king came of age in 1388 and took control, it seemed that France was entering a new era of prosperity. But in 1392, disaster struck. On the 5th of August 1392, Charles VI led a military campaign in Brittany. It was a hot summer. The king rode along a road through a forest, surrounded by his retinue. Suddenly, a ragged man leaped from the bushes, grabbed the king's bridle, and shouted, "Do not ride further, noble king, you are betrayed." The guards drove away the madman, and the procession continued. But the king was agitated when one of the pages dropped a spear, and it clanged against another rider's shield. Charles recoiled at the sound. Suddenly, the king drew his sword and began to strike right and left, shouting that enemies surrounded him. He wounded several courtiers, killing 4 people, before he could be disarmed and tied up. Charles convulsed, recognizing no one, uttering incoherent words. The fit lasted several days. Then the king recovered, remembering nothing of what had happened. Doctors threw up their hands. The illness was unknown, and they did not know how to treat it. Contemporaries called this affliction madness. The fits recurred with alarming regularity. Sometimes the king was lucid for months, ruling the state wisely and justly. Then suddenly, a clouding of the mind would set in. Charles would not recognize his wife and children, would run through the palace, breaking furniture, and refuse to wash or change clothes for months. Once he proclaimed that he was not the king, but someone named George, made of glass, and feared shattering if anyone touched him. In his lucid moments, the king understood his condition and suffered from it. The king's madness plunged France into a political crisis. The king's uncles seized power, renewing their struggle for influence. The rivalry between two factions became particularly fierce, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. The Armagnacs were led by the king's brother, Louis, Duke of Orléans, an intelligent and ambitious prince who effectively ruled France during Charles's periods of madness. The Burgundians united around Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and then his son John the Fearless. Both parties sought to control the ailing king and, through him, the entire kingdom. Their feud divided the French nobility into two warring camps, which would prove catastrophic for the country in the future. Meanwhile, England was experiencing its own upheavals. Richard II, who grew into a capricious and despotic monarch, clashed with the high nobility. In 1399, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster, took advantage of the king's absence in Ireland and landed in England with a small detachment. The nobility and common people supported the usurper. Richard was overthrown, imprisoned, and soon died under mysterious circumstances. Most likely, he was murdered or starved to death. Henry became king as Henry IV, founding the House of Lancaster. The new king was occupied with suppressing rebellions in England itself and repelling Scottish invasions from the north. His authority was challenged by many who considered him a usurper. Wales rebelled under the leadership of Owain Glyndwr, who proclaimed himself Prince of Wales. The rebellion would last 15 years, and English troops would get bogged down in the mountains of Wales, fighting guerrillas. France received a respite, but internal strife continued. On the 23rd of November 1407, an event occurred in Paris that determined the subsequent tragedy. Louis of Orléans was returning from the Queen's residence when he was attacked by assassins. 18 masked men hacked the Duke to death with swords right in the street. The assassination was organized by John the Fearless of Burgundy, who eliminated a rival in the struggle for power. Initially, the Duke denied involvement, but then publicly confessed and even commissioned a theological justification for tyrannicide, claiming he had killed Orléans for the good of the kingdom. The widow of the murdered man and his son, Charles of Orleans, swore revenge. Around them gathered the supporters of the deceased Duke, who became known as the Armagnacs, after the Count of Armagnac, who led the faction. France split into two warring factions. A civil war began that would weaken the kingdom so much that it would become easy prey for an external enemy, and this enemy was already preparing to strike. On the 20th of March 1413, the English king Henry IV died. Exhausted by illnesses and constant rebellions, the throne passed to his 25-year-old son Henry V, a man who would become France's most formidable opponent since Edward III. In his youth, the prince was known as a reveler and brawler, but upon ascending the throne, he transformed into a strict, disciplined monarch, obsessed with the idea of restoring English possessions in France and even conquering the French crown. Henry V meticulously prepared for war. He strengthened the crown's finances, suppressed the last pockets of resistance in England, and concluded a truce with Scotland. The king demanded from France the return of all lands promised by the Treaty of Bretigny, plus payment of the arrears on John the Good's ransom, plus the hand of a French princess with an enormous dowry. When the French refused, Henry declared war, again proclaiming himself the rightful king of France. In the summer of 1415, the English fleet transported an army of about 12,000 men, 10,000 archers, and 2,000 heavily armed warriors across the English Channel. This was the most prepared and disciplined army England had ever fielded. Henry landed at the mouth of the Seine and began the siege of Harfleur, an important port city. The siege lasted 5 weeks. The English stormed the walls, undermined them, and bombarded the city with cannons. Artillery played a significant role in the war for the first time. On September 22, Harfleur capitulated, but the victory came at a heavy cost to the English. A third of the army died of dysentery, rampant in the besiegers' camp. The king himself fell ill but survived. Henry understood that with the remnants of his army, it was impossible to march on Paris. He decided to march to Calais, demonstrating his presence to the French and returning to England before winter. On October 8, the English army, now numbering about 6,000 men, set out north. The French assembled a huge army to intercept the English. The French army numbered between 25,000 and 36,000 men. The exact figures are unknown, but the French superiority was overwhelming. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, led the army, but the princes of the blood and noble seigneurs, each claiming the main role in the upcoming victory, held real influence. The French pursued the English, cutting off their path to Calais, forcing them to accept battle under unfavorable conditions. On the 24th of October 1415, the English army approached the village of Agincourt in Artois. Ahead lay a narrow passage between two woods, and beyond it, the lines of French troops were visible. The path to Calais was cut off. English soldiers were exhausted by a 2-week march, hungry. Provisions had run out several days ago, and the men were eating nuts and roots. Many suffered from dysentery. The French, by contrast, were fresh, well-fed, and confident of victory. They even argued over who would capture the English king. Henry V spent the night in prayer. He understood that his army was on the brink of disaster, but there was nowhere to retreat. The king forbade looting and violence against civilians on the march, strictly enforced discipline, and ordered the execution of several soldiers for marauding. Now this discipline was to give an advantage in battle. On the morning of October 25, St. Crispin's Day, the English lined up for battle. The position was the same as at Crécy and Poitiers. Archers on the flanks, dismounted knights in the center, sharpened stakes, pointed towards the enemy, were driven into the ground in front of the position. Recent rains had turned the plowed field between the armies into a continuous bog. Henry ordered his troops to advance, approaching the French within shooting range, provoking them to attack. The French hesitated. The constable wanted to wait until hunger forced the English to capitulate, but the knights yearned for glory. The French army was drawn up in 3 lines. In the first stood dismounted knights, armored infantry. In the second, even more dismounted knights. In the third, cavalry. Small cavalry detachments were positioned on the flanks, intended to attack the English archers. The French plan was reasonable. Cavalry disperses the archers, then infantry breaks the English center. But the narrow front between the woods prevented the deployment of the entire mass of troops, and the French stood in dense, unwieldy columns. The battle began with a French cavalry attack on the flank. Several hundred horsemen charged the archers but got bogged down in the mud. Horses could barely move their legs in the sticky mire. Arrows rained down, unseating riders. The attack failed before reaching its target. The surviving horsemen turned and rode back, crashing into their own advancing infantry. Chaos ensued. The first line of French knights advanced on foot. Encased in full plate armor, weighing 50 to 60 pounds, they slowly trudged across the boggy field under a hail of arrows. Many fell from exhaustion, suffocating in the mud. Those who reached the English positions were so exhausted by the uphill climb and the struggle with the bog that they could not fight effectively. English soldiers repelled the attack, finishing off fallen knights with daggers, thrusting blades into the slits of visors and armor joints. The second line of Frenchmen advanced immediately afterward, exacerbating the crush. Thousands of people pressed against each other in the narrow passage between the woods. Fallen knights could not get up under the weight of their own armor, and the bodies of comrades pressing from behind. Piles of bodies formed, among which even uninjured people suffocated and died. Contemporaries wrote that many French knights died without receiving a single wound. They suffocated under piles of dead bodies. English archers, seeing that the French attack was faltering, abandoned their bows and rushed into hand-to-hand combat with axes and swords. They finished off the French, plundered the dead, and captured noble knights, hoping for rich ransoms. By midday, the battle was practically won. The third line of Frenchmen, cavalry under the command of the Duke of Brabant and the Count of Marle, never entered the battle, seeing the futility of the attack. Many French aristocrats left the battlefield, unwilling to die in a senseless slaughter. But then something unexpected happened. A French detachment attacked the English baggage train in the rear, killing the guards and beginning to plunder the wagons. Rumors reached Henry that the French were regrouping for a new attack. The king, seeing that his small army was surrounded by crowds of captured French knights, many of whom were still armed, ordered the prisoners to be killed. The English soldiers initially refused. Killing prisoners contradicted knightly customs and deprived them of ransom. Then Henry ordered a detachment of archers to carry out the command. A massacre began. Hundreds, possibly thousands, of captured French knights were killed. Their throats were cut, their faces smashed with mallets. Many were burned alive, locked in barns. Contemporaries condemned this act by Henry as barbaric and unworthy of a Christian monarch. But the king acted out of military necessity. He could not risk his army for the sake of observing chivalric conventions. When it became clear that there would be no new French attack, the killing ceased. The surviving noble prisoners were kept for ransom. By evening, the battle concluded with the complete rout of the French. About 7,000 men died, including Constable d'Albret, 3 dukes, 90 counts and barons, and over 1,500 knights. The Dukes of Orleans and Bourbon, Marshal Boucicaut, and many noble seigneurs were taken prisoner. English losses amounted to several hundred men, including the Duke of York and the Earl of Suffolk. This was one of the most crushing victories in the history of English arms. Agincourt became a national tragedy for France. A significant part of the French aristocracy perished. The army was annihilated, the kingdom demoralized. Henry V returned triumphantly to England, where he was hailed as a hero. But the king understood that victory in one battle did not mean victory in the war. France was a vast country with a large population, capable of fielding new armies. A new strategy was needed: methodical conquest of French territories, city by city, province by province. In 1416, Henry V returned to France with a new army. This time he did not plan raids and rapid campaigns. The goal was the systematic conquest of Normandy, the richest province, which would become a staging ground for further offensive. The English army landed at the mouth of the Seine and began a methodical siege of Norman towns and castles. One by one, fortified points fell, and their garrisons capitulated or perished under the blows of English artillery. France could not organize resistance. King Charles VI was in a state of madness and could not rule. Power was seized by the Burgundians, led by John the Fearless, who controlled Paris. The Armagnacs held the southern provinces and supported the Dauphin Charles, the king's eldest son. The two factions hated each other more than the English. The Burgundians negotiated with Henry, ready to recognize his rights to the French throne in exchange for political guarantees. The siege of Rouen, the capital of Normandy, began in July 1418 and lasted 6 months. The city resisted desperately, hoping for help from Paris, but help never came. In winter, hunger began in the city. The commandant expelled useless mouths, the elderly, women, children, hoping to preserve provisions for the garrison. The English did not allow the refugees through, and thousands of people were stranded between the city walls and the siege works, dying of hunger and cold before the eyes of the city's defenders. On the 19th of January 1419, Rouen capitulated. Henry solemnly entered the city, proclaiming himself Duke of Normandy. The English occupied the entire province, expelling the French administration and replacing it with English officials. Normandy became an English possession for over 30 years. Henry organized effective governance of the conquered territory, ensuring compliance with laws, preventing soldier looting, and striving to win the loyalty of the local population. The Burgundians and Armagnacs attempted to reconcile in the face of the English threat. On the 10th of September 1419, John the Fearless of Burgundy and the Dauphin Charles met on a bridge in Montereau for negotiations. The meeting was supposed to end the civil war, but when the Duke knelt before the Dauphin, the Armagnacs from the prince's retinue drew their swords and murdered John. The murder was revenge for the assassination of Louis of Orleans 12 years prior. An eye for an eye, blood for blood. The murder of John the Fearless proved catastrophic for France. His son, Philip the Good, the new Duke of Burgundy, swore revenge on the Dauphin and concluded an alliance with England. Burgundy was a powerful state, controlling the wealthiest regions of the Netherlands, Flanders, and Burgundy proper. The Anglo-Burgundian alliance meant the encirclement of France. Henry V achieved what he could not by military force: recognition of his rights to the French throne by a segment of the French nobility. On the 21st of May 1420, a treaty was signed in Troyes that changed the fate of France. Under its terms, Henry V married Catherine of Valois, daughter of Charles VI, and became regent and heir to the French throne. The Dauphin Charles was disinherited, declared illegitimate, After the death of Charles VI, the crowns of France and England were to unite under the rule of Henry, or his descendants. The mad King Charles signed the treaty that deprived his own son of the throne. Most of northern France recognized the treaty. Paris, Normandy, Champagne, Picardy, and Flanders came under Anglo-Burgundian control. The Dauphin Charles held the central and southern provinces, the Loire Valley, Berry, Poitou, and southern France. He was called the King of Bourges, after the city of Bourges, which became his residence. France was split into two parts, each considering itself legitimate. Henry V did not live to see final victory. On the 31st of August, 1422, he died in the Château de Vincennes, near Paris, from dysentery. The king was only 35 years old. He left an infant son, Henry VI, who was not yet a year old. 2 months later, Charles VI the Mad died. According to the Treaty of Troyes, the 10-month-old Henry VI was proclaimed King of France and England. The regency in England was taken by the late king's brother, John, Duke of Bedford. In France, by another brother, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. The Dauphin Charles did not recognize the treaty and proclaimed himself King Charles VII. A new phase of the war began. A struggle between two claimants to the French crown. The English and Burgundians controlled the rich northern provinces, had a professional army, and experienced commanders. Charles VII held the less developed south. His army was weak and demoralized. The treasury was empty. Nobles doubted his legitimacy. It seemed that English victory was only a matter of time. The Duke of Bedford proved to be a capable ruler and commander. He continued his brother's policy, slowly expanding the territory under English control. On the 17th of August, 1423, at the Battle of Crevant, the Anglo-Burgundian army routed the Scottish-French forces. The Scots fought on the side of Charles VII, continuing a centuries-old tradition of ancient alliance against England. About 4,000 Scots died in the battle, including the Earl of Buchan, Constable of France, and the Earl of Douglas. On the 31st of July 1424, another crushing defeat for the French occurred, the Battle of Verneuil. The English army under Bedford's command routed the French, who lost over 4,000 killed. Among the dead were the Duke of Alençon and many noble commanders. The English advanced into the Loire Valley, threatening the last stronghold of Charles VII. It seemed the fall of the King of Bourges was inevitable. In 1428, the English besieged Orléans, a key city on the Loire, the last barrier before the heartland of Charles VII's domains. The fall of Orléans would mean the end of resistance. The garrison heroically defended under the command of Jean de Dunois, the illegitimate son of the murdered Louis of Orléans. The English built a chain of fortifications around the city, cutting off supply routes. The inhabitants starved. The defenders suffered heavy losses, but the city held out, hoping for the king's help. Charles VII was in despair. His army suffered defeat after defeat. Nobles defected to the English side. The treasury was empty. The young king seriously considered fleeing to Spain or Scotland, giving up the fight. Despair and defeatist sentiments reigned among his entourage. No one believed that the situation could be turned around. And then, in February 1429, a strange delegation arrived at the court in Chinon with an unusual request. At its head stood a 17-year-old peasant girl from the Lorraine village of Domremy. Her name was Joan of Arc. She declared that she heard the voices of saints, the Archangel Michael, Saints Catherine and Margaret, who told her to lift the siege of Orleans and crown Charles in Reims. Courtiers laughed at the country girl, but the king, exhausted by failures, agreed to receive her. Joan convinced Charles of her mission by telling him something known only to him, the content of his secret prayer. Charles ordered the girl to be tested. Theologians questioned her for 3 weeks, trying to accuse her of heresy or demonic possession. Joan answered simply and soundly, without contradiction. Women verified her virginity. In popular belief, virginity was considered a sign of purity and divine election. Finally, Charles agreed to give her an army. Joan was clad in armor, given a banner depicting Christ and 2 angels, and experienced commanders were assigned to her: Jean d'Alençon, Gilles de Rais, Etienne de Vignoles, nicknamed La Hire. On the 29th of April, 1429, Joan, with a detachment of about 4,000 men, approached Orléans. The English, besieging the city from the south and west, did not dare to attack the reinforcements. Joan solemnly entered the city to the ringing of bells. Her appearance lifted the spirits of the defenders. The townspeople saw her as a messenger of God. The soldiers were inspired by the presence of the Maid. Joan forbade soldiers from blaspheming, looting, and violence, and ordered prostitutes expelled from the camp. The army was cleansed and morally strengthened. On May 4, the French attacked and captured the English fortification of Saint-Loup. On May 7, they stormed the Tourelles bastion on the south bank of the Loire. Joan personally led the attack, climbing a siege ladder. An English arrow pierced her shoulder. The girl fell, but after bandaging her wound, returned to the fight. Her courage inspired the soldiers, and the French took the fortification. On May 8, the English lifted the siege and retreated. Orléans was saved. The victory at Orléans became a turning point in the war. It proved that the English could be defeated, restored faith in the legitimacy of Charles VII, and inspired the French people to resist. Joan of Arc became a symbol of national revival. She insisted on a march to Reims for the king's coronation. Traditionally, French monarchs were crowned in Reims Cathedral, and the absence of a coronation cast doubt on Charles's legitimacy. The English controlled Reims, but Joan promised to lead the king through enemy territory. In June, the French army marched north from the Loire Valley. One by one, cities opened their gates to the Maid. On June 18, at Poitiers, the French routed an English detachment commanded by John Talbot, taking him prisoner. The English lost over 2,000 killed, the French a few dozen. The road to Reims was open. On the 17th of July 1429, Charles VII was solemnly crowned in Reims Cathedral. Joan stood beside him, holding her banner. Now the king's legitimacy was beyond doubt. After the coronation, Joan wanted to continue the offensive, take Paris, drive the English out of France. But Charles VII and his advisors preferred negotiations to military action. The king concluded a truce with the Burgundians, hoping to detach them from the English alliance through diplomacy. Joan disapproved of this but obeyed. On September 8, the French stormed Paris, but the attack failed. Joan was wounded by a crossbow bolt in the thigh. The troops retreated. The king dismissed the army to winter quarters. In the spring of 1430, military operations resumed. Joan, with a small detachment, went to aid Compiègne, besieged by the Burgundians. On May 23, during a sortie from the city, her detachment fell into an ambush. Joan covered the retreat of her soldiers and was dragged from her horse by a Burgundian archer. The girl was captured and handed over to the Burgundian commander, John of Luxembourg. Negotiations for ransom began. Charles VII did nothing to free Joan. He did not offer ransom, did not try to exchange her for English prisoners. He effectively abandoned the savior of France to her fate. Perhaps the king and his advisors believed that the Maid had fulfilled her role and was no longer needed. Perhaps they feared her growing popularity. The English paid Luxembourg an enormous sum, 10,000 francs, and received the captive. Joan was transferred to Rouen, the capital of English Normandy. The English decided to destroy Joan not by sword, but by trial. They accused her of heresy, witchcraft, and wearing men's clothing, which was considered a sin. The trial was headed by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a French prelate serving the English. From January to May 1431, Joan was interrogated, trying to extract a confession. The 19-year-old girl, without education, confronted dozens of learned theologians, answering tricky questions with astonishing wisdom and common sense. On the 30th of May, 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in the market square of Rouen. She was tied to a post, surrounded by firewood, and set alight. The executioner was ordered to make the fire so strong that no ashes remained. The English feared that her remains would become relics. Joan cried out, calling upon Jesus, until the smoke suffocated her. The executioner later confessed that he saw a white dove fly out of the flames. The maid's soul ascended to heaven. Her ashes were thrown into the Seine so that no trace would remain. Joan's death did not stop the liberation of France. On the contrary, she became a martyr, a symbol of the struggle against the invaders. In 1435, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, disillusioned with the English alliance, made peace with Charles VII. Burgundy withdrew from the war, leaving the English without their main ally. The French army, reformed and reinforced with artillery, went on the offensive. In 1449, the French recaptured Rouen, the capital of Normandy. In 1450, all of Normandy fell. In 1451, the French invaded Gascony, the last major English possession in France. On the 17th of July 1453, at the Battle of Castillon, the English army under the command of the elderly John Talbot was routed. Talbot, hero of English victories at Crevant and Verneuil, died in battle. On October 19 of the same year, Bordeaux capitulated. The 100 Years' War ended. The English retained only Calais, which they would hold for another 100 years. France was devastated. Cities destroyed, villages burned, the population almost halved, but the kingdom endured, defended its independence, and formed a national consciousness. England plunged into the Wars of the Roses, a civil war that exhausted the English nobility. The two countries went their separate ways, and never again did English kings seriously attempt to claim the French throne. An era lasting 116 years ended, leaving scars that have not healed to this day. The 100 Years' War changed the face of Europe. It marked the end of the chivalric era. Simple archers annihilated armored aristocrats. Infantry and artillery supplanted cavalry. Feudal militias gave way to permanent professional armies. Centralized monarchies strengthened, suppressing the independence of feudal lords. National self-awareness triumphed over medieval universalism. France and England recognized themselves as separate nations, not parts of a unified Christian world.